The following is my conversation with Jon Weiss. Jon is an executive at one of the major hyperscalers, and he works with industrials and manufacturers in implementing digital transformation projects. In this show, we talk about digital transformation in the context of small to mid-sized companies, some of the benefits, some of the misconceptions, and some of the challenges. We talk about how mid-sized companies can leverage their flat hierarchies with a digital strategy to move really, really fast and move ahead of the competition. I hope you enjoy this program. One quick note, recently I released my latest AI guide, AI Unleashed, your guide to finding the perfect use case for your traditional organization. I wrote it for a number of my clients and prospects that are asking me how to find AI and machine learning use case within their company. I hope that you enjoy it. You can pick it up at go.mannybernabe.com/AI start, or you can check out the link in the description below. Now, my conversation with Jon. Thank you. Hey, Jon. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Yeah, Manny. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat with you today.
Very neat. Today, we want to talk about AI and analytics in the context of small to mid-sized businesses. I thought, Jon, we might start by talking about some of the benefits that you think that small and mid-sized manufacturers can leverage by tapping into these technologies. How do you see that? How do you think about that? And where are the blind spots for these mid-sized businesses? What aren't they seeing that is pretty clear to you?
So I think first and foremost, it's really important to understand that when we talk about digital transformation, innovation, whatever fun buzzword we want to use, right, to describe something innovative that's happening in manufacturing, it's really important to understand that it's not just the big players or the big fish, right, in the pond that are enjoying this kind of technology or that are embracing it. And I think what's really important about that is that not only is the technology accessible today for really any size business, most companies and most organizations that are vendors in this space, a lot of them are hyper focused on the big brands, the big logos. Everybody wants to put on a PowerPoint or claim a stake in the ground with somebody like a John Deere or a 3M or a General Electric, right? Those are all the names that we always hear about, but the reality is, and I would say don't quote me, but I know someone's going to quote me, but I want to say something like 96% of manufacturers have less than 200 people, right? The vast majority of organizations in this space are small and medium-sized businesses. Many, I think something like 75% of the 96% have less than 20 employees, right? So it's really very quickly when you look at industrial companies and manufacturers, you realize it's not just the big boys out there that are making the world turn, right? All of the suppliers, the tier 2s, 3s, 4s, the tier N suppliers that make up the value chain, most of these are small companies, right? And so I just wanted to call that out to help the audience understand that it's not like we're talking about a couple mom and pop shops here. We're talking about the majority of the industry, right?
Yeah. Right. And just like the bigger guys, they have just as much to gain from this technology as well in terms of improving their overall operations, enhancing the customer experience, or creating new business models. I'm wondering where you're seeing these types of companies get the most bang for their buck as they're trying to kickstart analytics, AI, or even just other digital transformation projects.
I think it's going to be different for every industry or function within manufacturing, depending what these companies make, right? There will be benefits for some just getting started with basic data capture and data collection. Still today, most small manufacturers really don't have insight into the nuances or the details around fault codes that are being thrown on HMIs and PLCs. So a fault gets thrown, meaning something happens, right, on a machine, something bad happens, and all of a sudden it stops, right? generally speaking, you have to then start to figure out what just went wrong, right? That's just one small example. Whereas if you actually had some kind of data strategy in place, and a part of that data strategy was visibility into unplanned, maintenance activities or unplanned outages, you would be able to quickly react and know what's wrong ahead of time, right? Very, very small and simplistic example, but it could be as simple as that, just getting baseline data about your process and your assets into a place where you could actually start to do something with it. Or it could be way more advanced, like some of the buzzwords that you hear about a lot with digital twins and predictive maintenance and all of this kind of stuff. So it's a really, really broad spectrum, I would say, when it comes to use cases. Now, what I will say, because I'm kind of sort of tap dancing around your question, Manny, because I don't want to make folks believe that there's just one use case that's a silver bullet to get started and get the most value, because realistically, that's not the case. It truly depends on what it is that you make and what your ecosystem looks like. But what I will say is that not only is it not just the large companies that are embracing this kind of technology when it comes to industrial data strategies, visibility throughout the value chain and the supplier network, but the smaller companies and the mid-sized companies that make the value stream, right? They create this value stream of suppliers and sometimes distributors on the other end, right? The folks in those brackets that start to embrace this technology today, they are really becoming the heroes of this digital transformation effort, because when a 3M or a GE or a fill in the blank, one of the top manufacturers or largest manufacturers, when they start to do these efforts around digitization and digital transformation, especially when they're focused on supply chain, one of the key ingredients to make all of this work is supplier visibility. Right. And so without embracing the technology at the small and medium level, the biggest people in this space actually can't be successful, which is quite impactful. And you don't really hear a lot of people talking about that.
That's a good point, because these larger players, they're all after supply chain visibility, but they're also taking in inputs upstream from smaller players that are either making specialized valves or tooling or other things that are going into the final product. And so the visibility at the bigger player is going to be a function of the visibility that you could gain upstream from the smaller players. So one way to make yourself more valuable downstream as a mid-sized company, if you are providing those inputs to those bigger firms, is to digitize, is to create more visibility. And that's a way to stand out amongst all the other suppliers. If you don't have to necessarily compete on price, you can say, hey, we're also going to give you a lot more visibility and more certainty in terms of knowing what's going to be coming downstream from us to you.
And if you want to be really provocative about this, right? So if we want to take a bold stance, we could look at it from the complete other side of the coin of, not only could you perhaps get out of this competitive situation where you're having to be very aggressive around pricing discounts and volume discounts and commits and things like that, flip the coin, and now you have potentially access to a lot of data that these companies might find valuable. Could you license it to them? Could you sell them the data, right, to help with their forecasting and S&OP planning and all of the things that revolve around the value chain? I don't know, right? Perhaps, maybe. It's a bit provocative, right?
Right. And I think what we did right now is we sort of touched on examples of those three basic objectives that we talked about. One is improving your overall operational efficiency. So we talked about that visibility. So if something breaks down, then quickly doing root cause on that and getting the machine back up and running to minimize your downtime. That's operational efficiency. But we also talked about increasing the overall customer experience, and for some of these mom and pop shops or these smaller operations, it might be the 3Ms of the world that are taking their items as inputs, and so you're making yourself more valuable to them by providing more visibility via their supply chain objectives. And then 3, we talked about creating a new business model. So now you have this data, and you can say, hey, 3M, like, would you want to have early access to this, or can we cut this up in a different way for you? Can we give it to you in a different way? Now let's start building on this digital transformation infrastructure that we've built up to provide more value in that way as well. So I really like those those three examples that
Yeah,
we're
and
touching
I
on.
forgive me because I get so excited about this stuff. I think I blurted out probably an hour's worth of content in like 1 minute. But I think it's really important to level set when we think about the different ways that this applies to organizations. And on the supply chain front, just before we move on from that one, I do think it's a really important call out. This is not a pie in the sky idea, by the way. Every manufacturer on the planet, every mature manufacturer on the planet, throughout the last 2.5 years, throughout this pandemic, right? They realized, hey, we need to invest in supply chain resiliency. And the heart of that is data-driven decisions in your supply chain, finding single source bottlenecks, for example, right? The days of having one supplier for a core component or a critical component, those days are numbered, right? Because the pandemic has really opened our eyes for some of the largest companies in the world that they can't be locked in the value chain to just one supplier for a component, because when there is a global event, let's just say that adversely impacts the supply chain, well, it only takes that one bottleneck and now you can't produce whatever it is that you make. And by the way, Manny, this is not new, right? This has been a challenge for a long time. Even if we think back to what happened back in Fukushima, right, with the nuclear event that happened there, right, and if I don't know if you know this, but there was a what I would call a critical supplier for all of the large automotive manufacturers that was based right outside Fukushima in an area that was impacted by the event. And it's been a while since I looked up this fact, but I want to say for the better part of a year, if not more than a year, all of the large, well, let me be careful when I say that, a significant portion of the large automotive OEMs, right, they actually could not produce new black paint. So for that period of time, if you bought a black car, it had already been painted before Fukushima happened, or it had been painted using inventory, right? Or excess inventory of black paint, but there was no new production for something like a year because there was a core component in the black paint that was only sourced in the whole world, right?
Wow. Well, and it's a good example. You can also look more recently to the microcontroller shortage that we've had over the last couple of years. I know that I've had clients that wanted to do a lot of prototyping for their connected products. We couldn't get the microcontrollers needed to prototype all the versions that we were working on, so it really slowed down our production. They were competing with Ford and GM to get these microcontrollers as well, so everybody was in line to get these. It was a major bottleneck. But the point is there that if you're I've heard this complaint from my medium-sized manufacturers and machine part makers, is that it's hard for us to compete beyond price. It's hard for us to differentiate ourselves. And the key takeaway here is that digital transformation, analytics, data, this is one way for you to break out of that price comparison. So you can offer more visibility, you can offer better customer service, you can offer data products and services, and they might all be built off your initial digital transformation initiatives. So that makes sense in terms of like one key benefit as to why small to mid-sized manufacturers might go after this. What's keeping them from having a great experience here? You mentioned that the hyperscalers, the big vendors, maybe they're overlooking these mid-sized companies because they don't have the massive budgets or the logos. So aside from being overlooked by the big vendors, what other hurdles and roadblocks are you seeing for these
Education,
folks?
for sure. I think a lot of the smaller and medium-sized businesses still lack a lot of the education and knowledge of industry trends and what's actually real in Industry 4.0 versus what's maybe a little bit more pie in the sky theory. And we kind of see the same things, or have seen the same things with IoT, for example, right? For many, many years, IoT became kind of this catch-all phrase where anything you did with anything in technology all of a sudden became IoT, right? If it was connected to the internet. But there was a time when IoT meant a very specific thing. It generally speaking, born out of the M2M world or mobile data management world, right? For connected device management is really where that all started, device connectivity. But what had happened over the years was anything that it felt like anything that was analytics analytics related, we called it IoT. Anything that was big data related, well, all of a sudden nobody talked about Hadoop and big data anymore. It just all became IoT, right? So I think it's kind of sort of the same thing in Industry 4.0, where you don't really hear so much about very specific industrial use cases or applications. Sometimes it just all gets kind of lumped into digital transformation or Industry 4.0, right? And so I think it can be hard for folks who have not navigated this space before to really decipher and determine what does all this mean, and what resources do I have available to help educate myself. And a lot of times, because they don't get the same level of attention that the large companies get, they miss out on that educational opportunity.
What's the best way to hedge against that? If you're a mid-sized company and you don't have an army of data scientists and data engineers and product designers or solution architects, but you need to figure out what's real for you, what's going to work for you, and what's still sort of, maybe on another horizon for on your roadmap. What's the mechanism that you recommend for getting at that?
I think before I answer the question, one thing you said is really important. If you don't have the engineering resources, you don't have the technical wherewithal in-house, you don't have the confidence that you can actually pull this off. That's another, I would say, mental barrier that holds the small and medium businesses back. I do think it's really important to understand, first of all, most companies, sometimes even the largest companies in the world, right? The largest manufacturers can't do this stuff themselves. So there's no shame in recognizing that you don't have the engineering wherewithal or expertise in-house. That's fine. You don't have to be a software company. Keep producing the widgets that you produce, right? And just lean on other folks to help you produce those better, faster, cheaper, right? Now, to answer your question, how can small and medium businesses essentially get this kind of education, and where do they start to have this kind of successful foundation, I think is the nature of your question. I would actually kind of take a step back from the technology to answer this one. And to me, the way I look at the smart manufacturing landscape today, very seldom do we run into technical challenges for really any use case. Okay. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm not saying everything's easy. I'm not saying everything is point and click and boom, you have, smart manufacturing and that's that. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the technology, generally speaking, for virtually any use case exists today, right? The question is, which use case is worth investing in for your business? That's how I would take a look, whether you're small, medium, or even a massive enterprise business. I would take a look basically internally first and see, where do we have bottlenecks within our process? Where do we have areas of improvement, whether it's from a lean Six Sigma perspective, whether it's as simple as, hey, I know I've got issues with quality. So if there was a way that I could increase, my customer satisfaction via decreasing quality defects, I know it would translate to X dollars in revenue or X dollars in additional sales. That's the way I would look at all of this from a business and process perspective. Once you lock that down, finding the technology to do this is actually some of the easiest stuff in this whole mix, right?
That's such a good point. I really appreciate that, because I think people might, if you've been away from the space for 3 to 5 years, you might be greatly underappreciating how much we've advanced in that short period of time in terms of the technology part. Like, if you need to do predictive maintenance, that's a pretty clear playbook. Predictive quality, image quality. I mean, these are all like playbooks that are pretty well established, and we can get up and running pretty quickly. The key question, to your point, is where do you need to apply that technology within your business flow that's going to have the maximum amount of impact? And why I think that is so important is because, especially early on with your initial projects and engagements, you really want like a really meaty one to make the effort worthwhile and to make the growing pains worthwhile. Because if you're just getting started with analytics, data-driven processes, AI, machine learning, there's going to be a steep learning curve. And to the extent that you can front load a lot of value by focusing on those big pain points within your organization, within your processes, it's going to help you get over that initial hurdle and make it to the other side, so that you can look back and say, hey, that was kind of painful, but look at this awesome technology that we now have in place. Here's a direct value that we can tie to it. Here's why our customers are happy about it. Here's why we think we're building a foundation to be even more competitive in the next couple of years.
It's not all. It doesn't all have to be the crazy, buzzwordy, fancy stuff that we see all over LinkedIn and all over the industry journals and stuff. Start with condition-based monitoring. Right. Start with real-time visibility of assets. You don't have to jump right into predictive maintenance and AI this and ML that. And we know that everyone loves to talk about that stuff, but it is really important to embrace a crawl, walk, run approach, right? Start small with something that's going to be beneficial to the business. And the reason why I keep coming back to this introspective look at how's our process performing, how's the business, what's the bottlenecks. The reason why I'm not talking about technology and I'm actually talking about process and operational type metrics is because, in my experience, the small and medium manufacturers are sometimes the hardest to convince that actually there is room for improvement. And so what I've seen personally when I've gone to job shops or I've gone to, just various types of smaller manufacturers, I wouldn't say all of them, but a significant portion typically believe that they're performing at a very, very high level. And well, why is that? Really simple, because they make the production plan. I mean, they meet the plan, right? Whatever it is that they have to produce, they figure out how to meet it. And so to them, they are being as efficient as possible because they're meeting plan every day or every order, whatever the deliverable is, right? And so I have been in discussions where, I ask, okay, what do you think your availability is on your equipment? Or what do you think your efficiency is on your equipment? And, you'll get answers like, I don't know, 90%, 95%. And, you kind of scratch your head if you've been in enough factories because sure, that's a really beautiful number, but probably the most prestigious manufacturers in the world don't even have 85 to 90% or 95% of availability and efficiency on their assets. There's no way, right? There's no honest manufacturer that's running at 95% OEE. Let's just be real about it, right? So it can be tough sometimes looking at the business and identifying the area of opportunity if you're not honest with yourself, or maybe honest is not the right word, but if you don't have enough of an open mind when you look at how to innovate within your process or your industrial environment. So that's just my one bit of coaching to the small and medium manufacturers that are listening. Look at the process with an open mind and just think to yourself, just go in with an open mind and pretend that you're not running at top efficiency or top availability, and think, what would it mean if I could make 50 more widgets a day, a week, a month, depending on what kind of volume business you have? What would that mean for you, right? And how would that impact your bottom line? And then when you think about, okay, well, if I could make 50 more of these things, I would make X dollars. What would I have to do to be able to make those 50 more? Does it mean I need another machine operator? Mm-hmm. Does it mean I need another machine? Does it mean I can automate a task? Yep. Does it mean I can get better about my quality or reduce my waste or reduce my scrap or reduce my tack time or reduce my cycle times? Or you see where I'm going with this, right? There are so many KPIs that feed that kind of output or that outcome. The question is, for your business and your process, which one should we focus on? Then we'll worry about the technology after that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And what I'm hearing is, like, listen, you may be leaving money on the table. You just have to be open to that, and then you have to take a critical eye to your processes and say, okay, where might I be leaving money on the table here? Where there might be waste, and assume and take a critical eye to your metrics too, because your metrics might say everything is green, but is that the case? Sometimes the metrics themselves are not very good, so you have to really scrutinize everywhere those key parts of your processes, and maybe even assume that the metrics are wrong to see where that money on the table that you're leaving behind is. So that's a good point. I think that we've also talked about misconceptions that mid-sized manufacturers might have, such as feeling like they need a $5 million budget to get started with some of these projects. Talk to us about that, because I'm sure that's changed as well over time too, where maybe 5 years ago, you needed a fairly sizable budget to get started with some of these new initiatives and projects, but I'm sure that's come down quite a bit. What are you seeing right now? What's sort of a good budget to be targeting? Is there like an annual revenue for a company that you think is a right fit to get started with these projects? Love to hear your thoughts.
I don't think so. I don't think you have to be $100 million business or a $10 million business or whatever. I don't think that's how this works, in my opinion. I am glad you brought this up because I was eventually going to try to bring us there too. So thank you. I do think one of the largest barriers as well is the misconception that it costs a boatload of money to get started with some form of digital transformation or smart manufacturing effort. 10 years ago, 8 years ago, yeah, you probably would have had to spend a lot more than you would have to spend today. Over the last, let's say 5 to 8-ish years, there have been a tremendous amount of ISVs or independent software vendors that have come out with applications that do some really, really incredible things. Some are cloud-based if you want that cloud access and visibility across plants and things like that. Some are on-prem, totally just depends what you have an appetite for from a deployment perspective, right? But point is, there are many applications today that are very easily consumable and priced what I would say in a very consumable and palatable fashion that even the smallest of players can embrace them. And that's everything from ERP systems all the way down to very pointed solutions that do things like visual inspection for anomaly detection or quality inspection, or time series mining tools that can sit right on top of your historian, or just getting a historian to store data, right? The possibilities are quite limitless, but totally agree with your point. It doesn't cost millions of dollars to get started. In some instances, it can just cost a couple $1,000s to get started. In some instances, it doesn't even cost that, depending on what you're trying to do, right? If you want to do some basic temperature sensing or humidity sensing as it relates to, a part of your process, you could run a POC or a proof of concept on a Raspberry Pi for about $50 and start streaming temperature data, right? Super easy. The question is it valuable enough for your business, right? Like what are you going to get out of knowing the temperature data? And then that kind of brings us into another part of the discussion that I'll talk about in a second. But what's your take on that? What do you think? Are you aligned with some of my comments?
Totally. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. I think for me the question is, do you first set aside a budget and say like, okay, we're going to set aside $100K or $150K this year to explore digital transformation projects, analytics projects, ML projects, and see where we land? Or do you first go through the use case assessment process to see how much value can be potentially untapped? Because if you start with the budget first and the cost side first, you may be overlooking big time bottlenecks within your operation that may be much higher than what you're thinking, and you may be overlooking those opportunities. And so I go back and forth on this. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, but I think in some instances there's just a lot of value that is being left on the table, and if you could demonstrate that value and say, hey, we invest in this is going to unlock $2 million worth of additional revenue for us over the next 2 years. Okay, it makes sense. It makes sense for us to put $200K on this right away. That's going to be a great payback period. So we would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm a big believer in proving out the value, or at least mapping out the value before you go and seek budget. To your point, actually, you summed it up really, really well. If you go blindly and ask leadership for 20 grand or 50 grand or 100 grand, and then you're going to figure out what you're going to do with it, right? That's a very different story than going to your leadership and saying, hey, I figured out a way that I can generate or save or fill in the blank X amount of dollars. This is what it's going to take to do that, right? The beauty of being a small and medium business, by the way, because that's really the focus of this discussion, typically that can happen a lot easier in a small and medium-sized business than a massive enterprise where you have budgeting cycles and you're already planning for the next year at this point, and there's a lot of organizational navigating you have to do in order to try to get your budget through, and you have to lobby with different executives if you're not a P&L owner or an executive yourself, right? So it can be very challenging versus the smaller and medium-sized businesses. Generally speaking, it can be much easier to go to the owner, to go to one of the key stakeholders within the organization and say, hey, look, this is what I did. This is what I found out. Do we have an appetite to invest in something like this? Right? It can be quite a bit right. easier, which also gives you the advantage if you're a small or medium-sized business, because that means you can start doing things a lot quicker than the bigger players, right? So I do think that's really important to note. Back to the original question around, do you budget or do you plan, for the use case first? So I did answer that part, but I will say there are two core components when you're trying to evaluate essentially the value, right, that you're going to get from this effort. You have to look at, of course, the ROI. That's what everyone talks about, right? Where's the ROI? ROI, that's return on investment, right? If anyone's not familiar with the acronym. So if I invest X amount of dollars into this project, what am I going to get out of that? How long is it going to take me to get my capital investment back? And then when do I start seeing actually a profit or some kind of a positive return out of this investment, right? But there's another side of the coin, which is the negative side. And I don't mean that's a bad side. I mean negative in the sense from a financial draw on it, right, is the TCO, or the total cost of ownership. And that's very important to understand too. Now, what I mean by that when I say total cost of ownership, it's really important that, especially as a small and medium business, that you understand what is it going to take financially to actually run this project. And it's not just financially, by the way. That also includes man hours. It includes staffing requirements sometimes. And it includes a lot of attention and missed opportunity or opportunity cost on other efforts. Because as a small and medium business, you only have so many resources and so many people. If you task people to focus on this, right, whether it's 100% of the time or just, an X percentage of the time, well, that's time that they cannot spend somewhere else. All of that stuff factors into total cost of ownership. The other thing I'll add too, when it comes to the technology side, don't forget to think about things like support costs, maintenance costs, upgrading and updating the software. By the way, all of these things I'm talking about, this is why people really, really like SaaS models, software as a service, because generally speaking, there are no hidden gotchas that are going to impact your total cost of ownership, because really with SaaS licensing, you get the updates, you get the support, follow the sun support from, assuming you're purchasing something from a mature SaaS company. That's why people really like that model, because they know if I spend X dollars a month or whatever my agreement is, right, I know all the updates are going to come and this and that. So I don't have to factor in the additional development costs for updating later, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great point. So ROI, that's return over investment. So for sure, return, you want to get a sense of what that payback is going to be over the next year, 2-3 years. And then on the investment side, the denominator, you want to make sure you're accounting for a fairly comprehensive total cost of ownership type of calculation, all the things that you mentioned: support, updating the software, staffing, any patching, any security stuff that has to happen. When do you think that assessment has to be made, and how early in the process is that? Is that like week number 4, or is that a month into it, 2 months into it? How do you think about that?
Depends how quickly.
When is that ROI?
Yeah, it depends how quickly you can figure out what problem or challenge you're going to tackle. That's step 1, right? Figure out what it is that we want to address. Step 2 is figuring out how do we want to address it, right? Since we're talking about smart manufacturing and Industry 4.0, chances are it's going to be via software, right? Maybe there's a hardware component too, but we're talking about technology. The good news is most vendors out there, if you like their technology and you're interested in using their technology, most vendors will help you establish an ROI justification. They will be transparent about a total cost of ownership, or at least they should be. And this kind of exercise is typically called value engineering, right? So you would ask your vendor to help you with
Mm-hmm.
some value engineering to basically take a look and say, well, if I make this investment with you, what is that going to look like for me? What's the payback? And then, of course, what's this going to cost me contractually if I use your technology? But don't be afraid to ask for help, or even in some instances, just pass the work over to your, your trusted partner and vendor.
John, it's a good point. I think one other question that comes to mind is, how do you think about, at least for small to mid-sized companies, deciding between going with the hyperscalers and building some of these solutions themselves in-house versus going with application vendors that maybe a better user experience but more generic and not as specific, maybe a little bit more expensive? How do you navigate that, or is that even a consideration that we should
Well,
be thinking about?
it's quite a bit more complicated than that, Manny, because it's not just hyperscalers and ISVs in the world. There are more players than that. You have OTSIs that have different types of technology for the ops folks and the quality folks, and they're the ones that are coming in, hooking up camera systems, PLCs, edge devices on the shop floor. Those OT system integrators sometimes have their own software packages and software offerings as well. So those are a player in the space. Then you also have the GSIs, the global system integrators, your Cognizants and Wipros and TCSs of the world. And for all of those global system integrators, you also have local regional system integrators that are more on the IT side of the house. And those folks also can help you implement software, build software from scratch, implement other people's software for you if you need help. So it's a bit of an onion when you start peeling the layers back, and it can be challenging to understand. What I would say, and I think really where you're going with this comment, is, do you buy or do you build? Simply put, right? When it comes to software or technology, do I buy it? Do I build it? I don't know if I'm the right person to tell you what to do, because every organization is different. Now, let's just be honest with ourselves. If you're a 20-person manufacturer, 100, 200-person manufacturer, you probably don't want to start investing in software development skills, engineering skills that are required to run the software day in and day out, because that's not your core competency, right? Your core competency is creating whatever it is that you create on that shop floor or in that plant. Right. So the good news is all of those crazy acronyms, GSIs, ISVs, OTSIs, all of these crazy letters, those are all different types of people that are there to help you install and run your software. Then it becomes a question of what type of software do I need and who offers it? Now, you mentioned building stuff yourself with the hyperscalers. That is one path where an integrator can use components from a hyperscaler and build a solution or build a pointed application for you. Also important to note, now I think all of the main hyperscalers, right, at least in the American market, there's three. If anyone doesn't know who we're talking about, it's Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. That's who basically powers the internet, right, in America. There are others in other geographies. You've got Alibaba in China and so on and so forth. Those hyperscalers today, to my knowledge, also offer pointed applications. So it's not just the building blocks that are required to build applications like years ago. Today, they also have pointed applications, and some of those are natively built or homegrown, whatever you want to call it, within the hyperscaler. Some of them are done in conjunction with partners and other vendors in the market. So it just totally depends.
And I think that's why it's so important to start with the use case and the value that you're unlocking for your organization, because that's going to determine these, how you're going to implement. So if you think that you're going to be tapping into something that is going to be a core differentiator for you and your business long term, for 5 years, for 10 years, all right, maybe it makes a little more sense to build in-house, control it, to be very custom about it. But if it's something somewhat generic, you just want maybe some more visibility on a particular machine, it's kind of not core to what you're doing, maybe that's an instance where you just want a SaaS off the shelf, like just send me a monthly bill
exactly.
kind of thing.
And the good news is for small and medium businesses, if you're going after a use case that's already very prevalent in this market, and I'm talking about things like that we mentioned already, condition-based monitoring, field services related applications, things that for example are intelligent about how they serve up work instructions to mitigate an outage, stuff like that. If we're talking about ERP systems, raw materials tracking, inventory management, right? All of the core components that really run industrial organizations, there's a point and click application for all of that stuff, right? Already there are ERP systems that are just very, very easily deployed. There are condition-based monitoring, predictive maintenance solutions that are easily deployed today. Where it starts getting really difficult and sometimes cumbersome is making all of these different systems work together. And that's why earlier we were talking about having a data strategy and spending time to really put some thought behind how are all of these systems going to integrate with one another. That's where really you have probably the largest struggle in all of this. Well, the second largest struggle, the largest struggle is people, right? Let's not fool ourselves. We are our worst enemies when it comes to change management and innovation.
We talked about first initial steps is setting up the data strategy and also identifying the right use cases. What would you put first? Would it be the use cases identification process or the data strategy?
That's a really good question, Manny, because depending on who you ask, and you can, I have this kind of discussion a lot is why I'm laughing, and that now I'm just laughing at myself because like these are the kinds of discussions I have with my wife at the dinner table and stuff. So I'm sure she really enjoys that. You know, to me, a cohesive data strategy is not dependent on use cases. Now, I actually got into this debate at work, which is also why I'm laughing. So this is just a very timely question is what I'm saying. I don't believe that you need to have all of your use cases ironed out before you embrace a holistic data strategy. And what I mean by that, just to be really clear, right? When I talk about a data strategy in industrial manufacturing or within industrial companies, I'm talking about establishing a single source of industrial data that various systems leverage to derive insights, right? So I'm talking about a single source of data for equipment on the shop floor, asset telemetry data, but it's also the same source of data for your ERP system, right? And it's the same source of data for the decisions that get made in your PLM and CAD processes and potentially even some MES and MOM components, right? And then you start getting into the newer stuff that maybe you've heard of on LinkedIn around unified namespace and what's, UNS and things like that. To me, that's just good hygiene when it comes to implementing technology. What you do on top of that becomes your OT and business applications. I don't think you need to know which of those apps you want to build first or which are a top priority before you embrace a data strategy. And now I'm not really answering your question though of what should you do first. I really think, Manny, that this is probably a parallel activity. I think you should, I think if I were to approach this if I were running an industrial company myself, I would probably do this in parallel swim lanes, meaning I would start to embrace good hygienic data architecture, and I would be getting the systems in place needed to store the data, to move it and transport it securely, while I also tasked some folks on the team to figure out which use cases are going to give us the most benefit. And I would likely pilot or run a POC, a proof of concept of whatever my, decided top priority use cases. I would run that proof of concept in conjunction with building out that data layer and that data strategy so that they sit on top of each other.
I really like that because one is you need to surface requirements and scope details for your data strategy, and that's going to come from the use cases that you want to implement. So that's number one. And then number two is the data strategy is a means to an end, and that's implementing these use cases so that you can reduce costs, you can wow your customer, or you can create a new business model. And that's where the use cases are coming into play. So I think you need that carrot dangling over everyone's as they're in the trenches doing all the data engineering, all the plumbing that nobody wants to do. But you're saying like, oh, we're doing this hard work so that we can have an amazing connected product and highly differentiate ourselves in the marketplace. And so I totally agree with you. The data strategy, it'd be nice to do that first or in parallel, in part because whatever use case you pilot is always going to be downstream of the data that's coming into it. Several times I've been brought in and I've been asked to do a machine learning project or an analytics or an AI project, and I always say like, okay, where's the data? How reliable is it? How clean is it? Oh, we don't know. We copy paste it into this, we put in Excel spreadsheets, and I'm like, okay, well, even if I build you the most perfect AI model in this week or two, I can't deploy it. There's no value to it because you don't have your data pipelines in place. You don't have the data strategy in place. So I think it's a very strong point. Anything else you'd add to that? It seems like you wanted to chime in.
No, just echoing what your sentiment. I mean, garbage in, garbage out, right? So you can build the coolest, sexiest generative AI app, whatever, right? You could build the coolest thing that exists today. If you're putting bad data into it, or you've not taken the time to actually establish some meaningful data strategy, and you're just piping all kinds of stuff into this app, you're not going to get the results you want, right?
100%. And I always remind my clients that data strategy, that's the vastly underappreciated part. When I was first learning the golf, my pops gave me this adage that this always stuck with me is that you drive for show, but you putt for dough. Right? Like all the highlights are always like people ripping it off of the tee and like just sailing. But the people that are winning the tournaments, they're like hitting those long putts, like not as sexy, not as cool, but that's what gets you tournaments. And in a similar way, the data integration, the data wrangling, the data strategy, that's going to be the dough. That's what's really going to help you make everything else downstream much easier. Again, it's hard to appreciate because it's plumbing, it's infrastructure, and it tends to be a cost and very painful because you're forcing yourself to look into your legacy systems, and sometimes you just don't want to look at it. It's so bad. But you have to kind of look at it and get that unwrangled to unlock that future value.
And you hit on something really important there. When you talk about embracing a data strategy or just establishing essentially the infrastructure to support, this pipeline or flow of your industrial data, you're right, it's an expense, right? That's an investment. And the reason why I really like to do that in parallel with a tangible use case or business outcome is because if you go to your leadership, especially at a small, medium business where they don't fully understand some of these topics that we're talking about because it's not something that exists today in the organization. If you go and seek funding just for an underlying data strategy, there's nothing tangible on the output of that, right? Other than it's cost. And so if you can say, hey, we're going to tackle this use case around quality or throughput or yield. And oh, by the way, we're going to make sure we're really buttoned up on the way we do this because here's this comprehensive data flow. And by the way, when we do our next use case, we just piggyback right off this infrastructure. Now it's built. That's a very different story, right? All of a sudden that becomes compelling for scale.
100%. And on the use cases, that's where you can get estimates on the cost savings, on the additional revenue, on the differentiators for your overall business model that you can then present as the return, the numerator in that ROI calculation. So that's a great point. Can we talk a little bit tactically about what a data strategy implementation looks like?
Yeah.
Walk me through that. What's the agenda for that? How do you kick that up? How long is that taking? What's that process look like for you?
We've been talking a lot about data strategy, and maybe we first just say why you need it. Yeah. So, because I don't even know if I've spelled that out yet. I don't think so. So he said this to me. It's not my saying, so I don't want to take credit for it. Somebody said this to me on LinkedIn, and it has stuck with me ever since they said it. But I think it's really relevant to this discussion. So when you think about why do I need a comprehensive data strategy, or why do I need this single source of truth for my industrial data? Why can't I just pop up some apps, right? I know some vendors, they've got some cool apps. Let me just go deploy a couple of them. The root reason, or really it comes down to contextualization, right? You only get so much value if you're only looking into a little window of data, right? If you're looking at a real-time dashboard of an event or a process, that's valuable. It's going to tell you what's going on, right? When it becomes really valuable is when you can contextualize it with other things in your process or historical data so that you can start to derive patterns, right? And now I mentioned the saying, so I'm going to tell you the saying. Thank you for waiting. So it really comes down to the difference between knowledge and wisdom, okay? And the example is knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, yeah? Wisdom is knowing you don't put it in your fruit salad, yeah? It's the same thing with data, and it's the same thing with these applications in manufacturing, right? If you just pop up pointed applications and they're disparate siloed data sets throughout your enterprise, yeah, you've got a lot of knowledge, but let's be real, you don't have any wisdom. Right. You don't know how an outage on this one machine just impacted your sales and ops planning, or how it just threw off your inventory levels because now you've got more consumables that are getting spent to do rework or whatever it might be, right? If you don't connect those dots through a comprehensive data strategy that connects these dots, right? If you don't do that, you're never going to get wisdom. You just have a lot of knowledge, right? And then you have to, you really have to ask yourself, how valuable is that knowledge if you can't really capitalize on it?
And John, let's also mention that most companies are in this situation where they're not collecting wisdom; they have a bunch of knowledge or data points. Is that would you say that's fair? Like, I think most companies do not have the comprehensive, holistic data strategy integration to be able to provide good context across a good footprint within their organization to make strategic decisions over an extended period of time. That's how I would kind of define the overall utility of having that good data strategy. And I've worked with some major big time players, and I'm oftentimes surprised how siloed everything is. Is that, have you been seeing that?
No, I totally agree with that. It's across the board. Even at the largest and most prestigious manufacturers in the world struggle with that, right? And I would say sometimes it's even simpler than that. It's not even that they don't have the wisdom, right? Sometimes it's very common to come across historians or just historical data mechanisms that are not being used, period. And they could have no joke, 10, 20 years worth of data that no one ever looks at, just once in a blue moon when there's a very specific reason to look at it, right? That's not even knowledge at that point. That's just, you're just wasting money on data storage somewhere.
I think this is all the more reason why this can be a potentially big advantage for a small to medium-sized player, because if you combine your agileness and you supercharge that with a very digital and data strategy powered organization, you're just going to go so fast. You can move so much faster than everybody else. And I think if you want to look at an example of this, you can look at Tesla versus the big traditional automakers, and how Tesla has been able to move so much faster than the big automakers, in part because they probably have a more sophisticated data infrastructure, data strategy in place that allows them to do that. You can combine the speed of a startup of a Silicon Valley type of company with the data to move much faster than your competitors.
Pros and cons to that one. So now we're going to get into a healthy debate here. So the thing about Tesla, most people that I see talking about them on the internet will make comments like they're really just a software company who happen to make cars. And so that goes to your point about embracing technology and getting really aggressive on the technology front, for sure. Everyone knows, how advanced Tesla is technically. Now, from a manufacturing perspective, a lot of people probably know just how bad the quality is for Teslas. So where am I going with that? I don't really know. You mentioned them. All I think about is misaligned door panels and leaks and maybe a couple fires here and there. I don't know. But I'm not hating on Tesla. The cars are really cool. They're fantastic performance machines. I mean, they're beasts. But the reality is, so I actually posted about this on LinkedIn, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago. Tesla is so the margins on their vehicles are astronomical compared to the other companies, right? Why? Some of that is economies of scale. Some of that is they only make few models compared to competitors. one of the single largest drivers, which you may or may not know, there's significantly less components inside of an EV than there are in a combustible engine vehicle. So they're sourcing less, they have less suppliers, the attack time's a lot quicker, right? Assembly's a lot quicker. It's less stuff that goes in those things. But what I would say is if they dipped into their pockets a little bit in those fantastic margins that they have and they invested in some quality solutions like we're talking about today, you would wonder if, maybe the panels wouldn't be so misaligned and stuff like that. But perhaps a discussion for another day.
Ooh, but then where would the competition be, John? Because
I tell you, man,
that...
I'm not a big car
goodness.
guy. I'm more on the music side. You can tell behind me. I love my guitars and stuff, so I don't have posters of cars and things like that. I'm not a gearhead. I'm not a big car guy. But I will say, if I were, Tesla, whatever, I would probably be pretty worried about the competition that's coming because, Mercedes, Toyota, all of the big manufacturers, it's heating up and they're making some beautiful EVs and they do not have the quality problems that Tesla has. Tesla also has issues. Well, now this is turning into like a Tesla discussion, but it's really important to this discussion because it illustrates how even the largest players struggle with this. They have also had major issues with forecasting, production planning, S&OP planning and forecasting, demand planning and forecasting. So all of the supply chain and production forecasting components, they have really struggled with that. And I was one of these people that were impacted by it, about a year ago. I tried to buy a Tesla, maybe 2 years ago now. I was on the wait list, right? I was going to buy one. And about every 3 months, they pushed my delivery date back. And it kept happening and it kept happening and kept happening. And all that told me as somebody who worked in this space is that these guys have no idea how to mitigate and plan for demand, and or they really don't know how to account for production challenges that then impact sales, right? So I will leave it at that, though. I won't continue to berate Tesla.
Yeah, the point is if you feel like you're a little bit behind the curve on some of this, everybody's in the same boat. We're all trying to get better at this, and it's hard for everybody, but we all have to do it. That's where the industry is going. If we can go back to the question around the data strategy, tactical tips for people, if you're a mid-sized company, what does that plan look like? Is that like a 4-week process? Is that an 8-week process? How would you outline that for someone that wants to try to do that in the next quarter or so?
See, you got me all fired up, Manny. I didn't even answer the question. So I would say step one, take inventory of what it is that you have in your IT and OT infrastructure. Know who makes your PLCs, know who makes your historians, who's your vendor for your historian. If you have a historian, get a fundamental understanding for how do you capture, process, and production data today. Where does it live? What's the retention policy, or how long do you store that data for? For example, you may not have data storage at all. You might just have an HMI that logs fault codes for a rolling 24 hours, and that's it, right? That's very common, by the way. Becomes a real issue because that means it's impossible for you to detect patterns that are happening on that machine, right? So start taking inventory. What do we have in the floor? Where are we sending data to? How are we collecting it? How are we using it today? Are we deriving reports from that data? Are we doing everything in Excel, right? Maybe OEE is calculated in Excel. Maybe you don't calculate OEE. I don't know. Start taking inventory of where all of that data lives and how you're capturing it today and what the landscape looks like. Then you don't have to be worried about taking it upon yourself to figure out how to connect all of those disparate things. That's why there are vendors in this space, right? And there are many different types of vendors. I don't want to name drop anyone because I don't want to seem like I'm promoting a specific company. That's not my agenda here today with you, Manny. But, if anyone has questions and they're just, hey, John, how the heck do I even, who should I even think about calling for something like this? I'm happy to make some recommendations, unbiased, objective opinions. Feel free to reach out to me directly.
Okay, so step one is getting inventory of all your key data assets and just keeping track of them, knowing where they are. And then step two is going to be thinking about how you're going to be integrating all of those different data sources.
Start thinking about, just to piggyback on that. Sorry to cut you off, but I don't want to lose the train of thought either. there's forever the hot topic in industrial about cloud versus on-prem. Factor that into your decision making, right? Is there some data that we'd like to get off of our own servers to save on IT costs? Can we put it up in the cloud? There's a bit of a misconception. I'm going to call it a misconception. People might not like this, but there's a bit of a misconception that things are a lot safer if they're on-prem versus in the cloud from a data perspective. Mm-hmm. I do not believe that. I think there are, and perhaps we can do a follow-up discussion just on security. I think there are tremendous risks about keeping mission-critical data and historical data sets on-premise. You never know who's walking into your shop floor, plugging in a router that they bought from Best Buy. That happens all the time, by the way. If you think your folks aren't doing that in the production environment, you're wrong. Plugging in USB drives that they got at a golf outing or they got at a pub somewhere. You don't know what's on this stuff, right? Physical security. Once it's on your network, it's on your network. So you don't, I know there's a lot of fear around cloud. I don't want to necessarily, I'm not trying to influence you to put your stuff in the cloud, but I will say, inform yourself, do a little bit of research, make an informed decision on based on what kind of business you're in. If you're a regulated business, if you're, for example, if you're a medical device manufacturer and you have FDA compliance and things like that, or pharma, that's a little bit different than if you run a job shop and you're milling, steel components for turbine blades or something like that, right? It's just you have different risk tolerances and thresholds, so just make an informed decision. But you should consider where you store the stuff. Does it go on cloud? Does it go on-prem? That should factor into it.
Yes, absolutely. Inventory integration, think about where you want to be parking that on cloud or on-prem. Don't necessarily think that just because it's on-prem, closer to you, that it's necessarily safer. And then the other angle to dovetail to what we were talking about earlier is consider your roadmap as well. How is the data being used today, but also what are you planning to do with it in the next 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years? Like, how is the industry shifting? Are you shifting to, do you think that your machines are going to be connected? Because I had a couple clients that went from non-connected devices to connected, and that's a whole other set of tooling that you need to make that happen, to make that viable. So is that on your roadmap? Are you going to do that? Are you going to provide data as a service? Things like that. Now I would say consider that as you're mapping out this data strategy as well.
The use cases will factor in, but to my earlier point, I don't think you need to know all of the use cases or even have a prioritized one before you start thinking about strategically, single source of my industrial data, and if we want to call it like an industrial data lake or an industrial data fabric, that kind of mindset. But I do agree with you. There will be some nuances and some adjustments on what that architecture looks like depending on what your prioritized use cases are. And I also made the comment, just to echo it again, go in with an open mind. You bring up a great point on all of the different ways that your business can potentially transform, over the next 2 to 5 to 10 years, right? As data being a prime driver for that transformation, go in with an open mind and be creative. Get a little crazy with your use cases, right? Wouldn't it be cool if we blank, right? Chart them all out, put them in a spreadsheet, whiteboard it out, and then, from there you can always boil down to the ones that get the top priorities.
Right, and I would say assume that whatever you're thinking in terms of your business being more data-driven, analytics-driven, or ML-driven, double that or triple that. Because my sense is that just every industry is going to be more data-driven. It's going to be leveraging more analytics, more AI and machine learning. So just add that additional wiggle room, saying like, okay, well, we think we're going to be this data-driven type of organization. Well, just add a little bit more to that. What are we going to need to support those endeavors? Because my sense is that more and more companies are just going to start moving in that direction because they have to, and also because we have much more tooling, much more education available, and it's much more accessible.
Totally agree.
And any final thoughts that you want to leave the audience with, John? This has been great. We've just burned through this time here. I'm wondering if there's any final thoughts, and if not, maybe you can tell people how they can connect with you, how they can follow your work.
Absolutely. I will leave one more bit of knowledge here. So we have talked a good bit, at least I have today, about prioritization. Prioritize your use case, pick a use case with the most value, this and that. I do want to just drop one more bit that hopefully you folks find helpful around how do I actually prioritize, like what's important to me, right? Because hopefully when you get into this use case exercise, you start thinking about the different ways to leverage technology. I hope you come up with a whole bunch of use cases, right? That's the plan. You should come up with a whole bunch of stuff. The way I like to do this is I like to look at two factors, and almost only two factors. How difficult is it to do it, and how much is the business going to benefit if we do it, right? And you have to make sure there's a balance on those two things. A lot of vendors will come in and they use the term low-hanging fruit. Let's find low-hanging fruit, right? Everyone loves that term, Manny. I don't really know why, but everyone talks about low-hanging fruit. The reality is, if you're low-hanging fruit, meaning the easy application, so the ease of implementation is very high. It's not difficult to do it, but the payback or the value to the business is low. What's the point of doing the low-hanging fruit? No, that's how you get stuck in what's called POC purgatory, right? Where you did a science project and no one ever wants to roll it out at scale because the business, it doesn't even impact the business in a positive way, or it's so minimal it's not worth the investment. So don't be fooled that because something is easy it's worth doing. You want to find something right around the middle where you've got moderate to low implementation difficulty. So you don't want it to be too hard out of the gate, but you also want it to have a quantifiable business impact. Otherwise, it's not worth doing it, regardless of how easy it is. That's just my last little tidbit of 2 cents here that I'll share with you. But yeah, great to be here with you, Manny. I hope the audience found this helpful. If you'd like to connect with me, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so you can look me up. We'll put the link here, linkedin.com/in/J Weiss, JWEISS. Feel free to reach out anytime. And yeah, I'm always happy to talk shop, as I'm sure you can tell.
Awesome, Jon. Well, thanks for coming in on the show, and I really appreciate your LinkedIn content. So thank you very much for providing that. And yes, definitely encourage people to follow Jon on LinkedIn, and I'm sure we'll include a link to his profile in the show notes. All right, so thanks so much for joining us today, Jon. Really appreciate
awesome.
the discussion.
Thanks, Manny. Thanks for having me.